What is tempo? You see, earlier this week I asked that question talking to JJ, and then I brought it to the internet. And what I got was a flood of so many different answers. And that made me wonder, has anyone really defined it? And what I found was the answer is no. I hit the books so that you don't have to. I went all the way back to 1999, where Eric wrote about tempo and card advantage on a site called The Dojo. And Paulo Vitor Damo de Rosa's PV's Playhouse Tempo from 2010. I read Reed Duke's article from 2014. Of course, I checked the MTG Wiki site on tempo, and I referenced my favorite text by Patrick Chapin, Next Level Magic. And what I recognized by reading all of these texts was that a clear definition of tempo is still missing from our lexicon. Today, we're going to define a magic theory in a way that has never been done before. But how are you going to do this, Navigator? You haven't even been to a pro tour. That's right. Here at ACV MTG, we are where you are. So what we're going to do is we're going to examine the texts by some of the best players to have ever played the game. We're going to compare them and infer the true definition of everything that they are talking around in a way that we understand this is tempo. The first thing we're going to do is talk about some of the basics of Magic that we may already know, but highlight them as the boundaries for the structure around which we'll define tempo. So there are two key elements to understanding our boundaries. First is that we get to play one land per turn. And the second is that we draw one card per turn. This is going to be important to defining tempo because even though it goes without saying, these are the only two commonalities we'll find within each definition that we review. So let's dive into the text. First up is Tempo and Card Advantage by screen name Eric from The Dojo, written on January 1st, 1999. In this article, Eric outlines the foundation for every other text on tempo. He writes the basic limitations, the one card and one land per turn. But more importantly, he tells us that one land is indicative of time in a game. So one land per turn means one land equals one turn. More importantly, off of this, Eric builds a relationship triangle. He explains tempo as an interaction between time, mana, and the casting cost of spells. And then he goes on to explain an overall strategy in deck building, that decks tend to either have a tilt towards fast timing and low mana value of spells in order to win the game, or card advantage to bring out bigger threats in order to win the game. Keep in mind, Magic looked very different then than it does now. Next up is an article called Tempo is Interesting by Stephen Menendian, written in 2004. You'll notice here something that we see in a lot of texts where we talk around what tempo is, the feeling that it provides in a game, without really defining it. Now, Stephen talks about tactical and strategic options in a game. Okay, what's tactical and what is strategic? A tactical decision is one made on the ground level. Think of it in Magic as your turn-based decisions. Things that you're doing in steps and in phases in an individual turn to get to your overall strategy. Now, a strategic option is that end game. In Magic, your strategic option is the thing that your deck is trying to do in order to win. So you can see I drew an arrow going up because your tactical options inform your strategic options. Stephen writes that every deck has a strategic option to victory. Stephen writes that the effect of tempo is to create an environment where an opponent's tactical options and eventually strategic options begin to dwindle until the game ends. So he writes that your effective use of tempo, whatever that word may mean, will make the tactical decisions made by the opponent diverge from where he's actually trying to go. When the tactical maneuvers no longer are available, the strategy begins to falter because your opponent has to spend resources just to stabilize the game. Next is one of my favorite writers, PVDDR. He's one of Magic's greatest players, and he gets to the root of what tempo actually means, but still acknowledges that the community as a whole fails to define it. Now, Paulo's article is interesting because when I asked what is tempo, people were caught on the semantics. Tempo meant rhythm, like in music, or that tempo means temporary, like another one of our authors will describe it as. Whereas Paulo gets to the Latin root of the word. Tempo is derived from tempus, which equals time. And Paulo's theory on tempo revolves all around time. That in order to make the right play, you have to nail the timing. And that is a high tempo play. Again, we're not really defining tempo, rather the effect of tempo. Paulo writes that in order to win, you have to play your cards at the right opportunity or the right time. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. First, we understood the limitations of the game. One card and one land. Then we equated that one land essentially is a metric for time in a game of Magic. And tempo means time. So we have one part of this concept all around. We know that it creates an environment where you must make decisions to affect the tactical options of your opponent and advance your tactical options to create strategic options in order to win the game. And we know that in order to win the game, you have to be making these decisions at the right time. Now for a Pro Tour champion and crowd favorite Magic the Gathering player, Reed Duke. Reed wrote about tempo in 2014. Now Reed differs from our previous authors because he wrote that tempo is a resource. And at its most basic form, tempo is board presence. Now, Reed also makes an interesting assertion that creatures are the basic units of measurement in tempo. This can best be defined by an aggro strategy, like the one that I defined in this video where we covered the red aggro micro archetype. Reed talks about a creature-based strategy where you can be proactive by seizing the initiative via attacks. So for Reed, tempo is aggro, maybe? Creatures attack, and that gives you the initiative and tempo. Now, he also recognized that you play one land per turn, and that leads to a progressive board state in Magic where tempo swings become wider and wider as the game progresses. Next, I visit one of my favorite texts in Magic the Gathering theory, and that's Next Level Magic by Patrick Chapin. From Next Level Magic, I boil down to what I essentially called as Chapin's principles of tempo. First, he defines tempo as a temporary advantage, in that it is either gained or lost through tangible or intangible resources as steps, turns, and phases end. And those tangible resources are the limitations we talked about earlier, your land drop and your card draw. And you have intangible advantages in a game like additional combat steps when you play creatures early, or by denying steps and phases or turns from your opponent by, say, countering their turn 4 play. Chapin encourages us to evaluate our resources by asking the question, how much is this resource worth to me right now? So he's getting to something. But he's also saying that this tempo, in that he means a temporary advantage. It doesn't mean anything if you don't do anything with it. Now that we've gone through some of the basic and most important texts in our game on tempo, we need to compare them to see where things align and where things don't, and then come out with our solid definition on what tempo is. So I came up with this pizza-like diagram to show all of our authors put together because I couldn't think of a better shape. Let's take a look. So at the center of all of them are our limitations. 1 card per turn and 1 land per turn. That's the basic function of Magic. Chapin says that tempo is where you get a temporary advantage. Reed says tempo is a resource. Eric tells us that mana is an indicator of time. Steven defines the effect. Paulo agrees that tempo is time. And of course, the wiki says tempo is a term to describe the pace at which a player can play threats. So here comes the ACV MTG definition of tempo.
ACV MTG has had enough of the partial or abstract concepts about tempo. So today we will create for you a definitive concept that you can use to quantify your turn-by-turn interactions with tempo. In short, we're going to construct a tempo definition hill to die on. Here, we choose violence. The first concept we want you to understand is something we call tempo momentum. This is the cumulative effect of tempo over multiple turns. This is the snowball effect a player creates that builds up throughout the game. Positive momentum means you're consistently outpacing your opponent. So how do you build tempo momentum? You do this through something we call relative tempo gain. Relative tempo gain measures the impact of a single play relative to its cost. It's a way of evaluating how much value you get from your mana compared to the cost for your opponent to respond. The more efficient your play, the greater your relative tempo gain. Now visualize this. You and your opponent are both racing toward a finish line. The speed at which you are traveling has meaning only relative to the speed your opponent is traveling. At every turn, you are both trying to keep the initiative, trying to dictate the relative speed the other player is going to travel during the race. Even though you will both slow down relative to the finish line, your speeds relative to each other are what really matters. To have a positive tempo means you are moving faster relative to your opponent. To have a negative tempo means your opponent is moving faster than you. Tempo is a relative and cumulative measure of impact over time, relative to your opponent's impact over time. Now let's talk about how tempo momentum relates to relative tempo gain. For those of you who like formulas, here's what relative tempo gain would look like. Over a series of turns T, tempo momentum sums up your relative tempo gain minus your opponent's relative tempo gain. A positive TM indicates that you are consistently gaining tempo, while a negative TM suggests that your opponent is gaining tempo on you. Rapid tempo gains suggest a winning tempo. Remember, the goal is to win the tempo game against your opponent, which will more likely than not result in a game win. So how do you quantify relative tempo gain? It's a little subjective, but we're going to give you some factors to think about. So here's what a relative tempo gain formula would look like. Now the first fraction quantifies how much value you get from your mana investment. The second fraction measures the pressure you place on your opponent's available resources. The overall RTG is dependent on both. How well am I using my resources? How well is my opponent able to respond? This is where you will force your opponent to make inefficient plays, paying too much to gain too little, or they will make you have less of an impact. When we talk about relative tempo gain, we're looking at assessing the impact of your plays. Well, how do you assess the impact of your plays? Let's talk about it. This is the subjective part. You could use several different, this is what we've come up with. So our board presence, our disruption, card advantage, strategic impact, life total impact. Each of these impacts can be graded on a scale from 0 to 5. 0 being no impact and 5 being a major impact. Tempo impact is essentially the net effect of how well a player leverages these categories. An opponent's response cost can be calculated by identifying possible responses, estimating their mana cost, considering other situational factors such as cards in hand or untapped mana, and adjusting for your opponent's overall strategy. Now, through this framework, not only can you calculate your tempo, but you can also calculate your opponent's tempo and a tempo differential. This is the difference between your opponent's tempo and yours. This represents an overall tempo advantage or disadvantage. And while tempo in Magic often involves a give and take dynamic, it's not strictly a zero-sum game. There are situations where both players can maintain, lose, or even both gain tempo simultaneously. The concept of tempo involves more than just a direct transfer of advantage. It's about the broader flow and momentum of the game, which can evolve in very complex ways. In short, tempo determines who has the initiative, who gets to make proactive plays, and who is forced into reactive positions. Ultimately, tempo can shape the path to victory. A player who consistently maintains better tempo can pull ahead and either win quickly by overwhelming the opponent or set up a dominant position that leads to a win in the long run. Thank you for listening. This has been our definition of tempo.
Guys, thanks so much for watching this video. If it helped at all, or if you have any other questions, drop a comment below. If any of your friends would benefit from understanding tempo as one of the most fundamental theories in Magic the Gathering, please share this video with them. And as always, like and subscribe. I'm Navigator. Thanks so much for watching. And remember, always choose violence.